Friction. Let's talk about friction and the types of friction. So, friction, what is it? Well, friction resists motion. Friction causes moving objects to slow down and it produces heat. So that's why a lot of times whenever you're cold and you rub your hands together and it makes your hands all nice and warm, that's friction between your hands that's producing that heat. So there are four types of friction: static, dynamic, sliding, and rolling. Mostly in our class, we're going to be talking about static and dynamic. So static friction. Static friction occurs between stationary surfaces in contact. So always remember static, stationary, S and S. So with static friction, it helps things to stay put, stay where they are. Without static friction, your feet would slip out from under you, making it very difficult to walk. So obviously static friction is very important. Static friction acts between two surfaces that are in contact, but not in motion with respect to each other. This force prevents objects from sliding. It always opposes potential motion or works against potential motion. We're also going to be looking at the equation to calculate static friction. So if we wanted to determine the static friction that is acting on an object, we would use this equation in the top right corner. So static friction is equal to the coefficient of static friction, which is this mu Greek letter right here. And this is usually given to you in the problem unless you're solving for it. But it's usually between 0 and 1. So it's some sort of decimal number. And then you multiply that coefficient by the normal force that's acting on the object. All right, dynamic friction. So dynamic means that some sort of change is happening. So changing motion. Maybe you're walking, running, moving. There's some sort of movement going on. So dynamic friction acts between two surfaces that are in contact, and they are in motion. So now with dynamic friction, things are moving, they're in motion with respect to each other. This force reduces the acceleration, so it works to slow down the motion, slow down the acceleration, and it always opposes the direction of the motion. So if the object's moving to the right, this dynamic friction would be going towards the left. Opposes, it's going in opposite directions. Some people also call this dynamic friction a kinetic friction. So to solve for this dynamic friction, our equation looks very similar to before, but instead of using the coefficient of static friction, we're going to be using the coefficient of kinetic friction. So it's still the frictional force is equal to the coefficient times the normal force. All right, sliding friction. Third one. Sliding friction occurs when one surface slides over another. Sliding friction is weaker than static friction. You use sliding friction when you write with a pencil. So the pencil, lead, slides easily over the paper, but there's just enough friction between the pencil and the paper to leave a mark. So we use sliding friction every day to write with our pencils. Rolling friction occurs when a rounded surface rolls over another. Rolling friction is much weaker than sliding friction or static friction. So rolling friction is the weakest one. That's why if you want to move something really heavy, you hope that there's wheels across or some sort of rolling object because that has the least amount of friction. So speaking of moving heavy objects, if you want to reduce the amount of friction, you want to use wheels or rollers. You want to use lubricants, produce a smooth layer between those two surfaces. And then lastly, sanding the surfaces, or just ensuring that they're somehow really smooth, because the smoother the surface, the less friction you're going to end up having. All right, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment.